Hello, my name is Lisa Hollifield, and this is my final presentation, Presidential Strategies in Vietnam from 1950 to 1975 for World History 375. For nearly 10 years, the American military embroiled itself in the South Vietnamese conflict to help stop the growing tide of communism and facilitate the independence of a new nation in Southeast Asia. Responding to the American public's equal desire for both retribution and peace, 4 separate United States presidents brought to bear distinctly different strategies, ranging from isolationism to direct escalation, each believing that theirs was the optimal plan to bring a swift, decisive end to the Vietnam War. As you can see, this presentation will be divided up between the 4 distinct presidential eras, starting with Eisenhower, moving on to Kennedy, then to Johnson, and finally concluding with Nixon. The Eisenhower era, which begins in 1953, was characterized by a motivation primarily to militarily assist France in reclaiming Vietnam as a colony, as at the time the French were embroiled in the Indochina War. However, when the French decided to abandon the war and leave, allowing the Vietnamese to form their own independent nation, Eisenhower was initially reluctant to commit any sort of troops to another foreign conflict so soon after the Korean War. So he instead decided to commit U.S. troops as more of an advisory role to assist in building up the new South Vietnamese army. With the signing of the Geneva Accords partitioning Vietnam into North and South, the North being communist controlled and led by Ho Chi Minh, while the South, it was democratic control by Ngo Dinh Diem. Eisenhower decides to back Diem for the fact that he is stringently anti-communist and also a devout Christian. Both qualities that Eisenhower deems as useful in combating the communist threat. In order to further U.S. interests in the burgeoning Vietnam nation, Addington relates in America's War in Vietnam that Eisenhower goes on to form SEATO, the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, which brings the Vietnam under the protection of the United States. Here are some photographs of Eisenhower meeting with Diem and the first meeting of SEATO in 1954. As Eisenhower era continues, Eisenhower's strategy is characterized by domino theory. He believes the justification for his interference in Vietnam is to stop the spread of communism, and he supports this theory by the fact that at the time Laos was having serious issues with the extreme rightist Pathet Lao communist movement, as well as the communist takeover of Cuba with Fidel Castro. The United States is embroiled with McCarthy and the Red Scare, and they're seeing communism spread more and more, so they want to do whatever they can to ensure that Vietnam won't be the next to fall. Diem at the time forms the Republic of Vietnam, and Eisenhower immediately sends military and economic aid because he wants the nation to re-establish itself and ensure that its military is strong enough to fight off the insurgency of Ho Chi Minh's troops in the north. He also forms the Military Assistance and Advisory Group Vietnam, out of the remains of the Military Assistance and Advisory Group Indochina in 1955, specifically to train the South Vietnamese Army, and switches tacks to institute a policy of massive retaliation using nuclear weapons if the U.S. is attacked at all. According to Spencer Tucker in his Encyclopedia of the Vietnam War, Eisenhower was also thoroughly paranoid of the idea of allowing open elections in South Vietnam because he recognized that Ho Chi Minh was extremely popular in the country. He feared if open elections were allowed between Ho Chi Minh and Diem, that Ho Chi Minh would most definitely win, allowing the country to unite itself under a fully communist banner. So as a result, he continues to send advisors to militarily advise Diem, despite the fact that at this point Diem's government is falling under extreme internal strife due to Diem's tendency toward authoritarian and suppressive rule. However, Eisenhower feels he has no choice at this point, as the uprisings in North Vietnam are continuing to grow. This leads us into the Kennedy era, starting in 1960. Kennedy as well supports the idea of the containment of communism and domino theory, but he doesn't necessarily agree with the use of nuclear weapons. He feels that this is too violent and direct an approach, considering what's going on in the United States and in the world at the time. The situation between communists and the United States has become so volatile that they've almost led themselves into a mutually assured destruction. So Kennedy feels the need to power down and look at this from a new perspective. He continues to support the Diem government as it becomes steadily more and more authoritarian and suppressive, violently beating down anybody that is that is communist or not Christian. At this point, he continues to keep the U.S. in an advisory role, providing an additional $200 million in military and economic aid in 1961, as well as supporting Diem's strategic Hamlet program, which Diem had initially enacted to send vulnerable peasant populations out of their villages and into protected communities away from the influence of the Viet Cong. The reason why the Viet Cong were able to influence these villages so easily was because the peasants were not happy. They were suffering under the authoritarian rule of Diem, and the Viet Cong were promising them bigger and better things if they defected to the communist side and came to the north instead under the rule of Uncle Ho. Here we have some photographs of Kennedy meeting with a representative from Vietnam in the White House. Most likely, this is Nguyen Dinh Thuan, the Secretary of State for the Security of Vietnam, and a photograph of some Vietnam peasants building a hut or a house in the strategic Hamlet program. As you can see, they did not have very much, and their situation was bleak. Because the peasants are not happy, the strategic Hamlet program decisively fails, and more and more peasants are turning to the Viet Cong. This is only compounded with the Bay of Pigs disaster and the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, which puts the United States and Russia literally on the brink a global nuclear war. At that point, the United States and Russia are within 90 miles of mutually assured destruction, which causes Kennedy to want to come at this from a different perspective. Douglas Bluefire mentions in the counterinsurgency era that Kennedy favors Army Special Forces and their training in counterinsurgency tactics. He believes that guerrilla warfare is the answer rather than direct nuclear attack. He then sends 16,000 more military advisors down to Vietnam to organize a peasant-based militia self-defense force highly trained in guerrilla warfare, which is a smart tactic considering that the Vietnamese for hundreds and thousands of years were well trained in guerrilla war tactics against incursions from the Mongols and the Chinese. He also supports the use of helicopters in counterinsurgency missions. Eventually, by the end of 1962, however, the United States government and the Vietnamese begin to realize that they can no longer sustain Diem's government. The violence from his anti-Buddhist suppression and his authoritarian role is no longer a feasible option. So Kennedy has no choice but to assist in the political overthrow of his regime. We'll never know what would have happened afterwards, whether or not Kennedy would have been able to pull the U.S. back out of the war, as he was assassinated in 1963, leading into the era of Lyndon B. Johnson. Johnson does support the fight of South Vietnamese against the Viet Cong, but like Kennedy and Eisenhower before him, he is hesitant to send troops. He doesn't want to involve the U.S. in a protracted war that no one is sure has a specific end. He's also concerned that if he does send troops and these young men begin to die, his chances of winning the 1964 presidential election will be threatened. He urges the South Vietnamese to fight to protect their own country, and like Kennedy before him, he also continues to send advisors and military and economic aid. However, according to Larry Berman's Lyndon Johnson's War, the Gulf of Tonkin incident would be a distinct turning point in this conflict. Now, even though no one knows for sure what exactly happened in the Gulf of Tonkin, whether it was the U.S. Navy personnel having itchy trigger fingers or an actual North Vietnamese attack, either way, it was enough to incite immediate anger on the part of Americans in the United States and a desire for retaliation against the North Vietnamese for this perceived U.S. naval vessel attack. Prior to this, Johnson was afraid that if he acted as Truman did in sending troops into Vietnam, as Truman had with Korea without the permission of Congress, he could severely harm his position and maybe even become impeached. The Gulf of Tonkin incident, however, was the motivation that Congress needed to pass the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution on August 7, 1964. They had enough public support to feel confident enough to pass this law, which authorized the president to take any measures necessary against North Vietnam. Here we have some more photographs of President Johnson and General Westmoreland, along with Truong in Vietnam, and the cover of a newspaper from Tennessee detailing the U.S. bombing of North Vietnam in retaliation for the Gulf of Tonkin. At this point, with the resolution firmly in hand, Johnson orders the bombing of North Vietnam, called Operation Rolling Thunder. Unfortunately, it's not very successful. According to George Herring's America's Longest War, because they kept having to roll back the start date of the bombing, this gave the North Vietnamese the chances that they need to move their lines continuously. And once the bombing actually began, the success of the operation was limited at best. The operation continues for three years, from March to November, March 1965 to November 1968. And at this point, Johnson realizes that he can no longer allow the United States to remain in an advisory role, that a direct conflict is going to happen whether he wants it to or not. And he sends first combat troops into Vietnam in 1965 after attack on a U.S. airbase at Pleiku. He also institutes the draft, and almost immediately the number of soldiers sent into Vietnam peaks at 500,000. Casualties begin to mount, as well as anti-war protests, as Johnson decides to stick with a no-win, no-end strategy. Whereas before, he didn't want to be the president that sent the U.S. into the war. Once he does, he doesn't want to be the president to lose it. And he refuses to bring troops back home until the war is over. This continues into the Tet Offensive and Siege of Khe Sanh in 1968. The Vietnamese have been planning this for quite some time. And as the media play up the hype of what appears to be every U.S. military base, air base, and embassy in the area falling prey to violent North Vietnamese attack, this makes Johnson's strategy look horribly bad. More and more soldiers are dying, and there doesn't seem to be any end, any foreseeable end, any light at the end of the tunnel to this protracted war. At this point, the support for the Vietnam War plummets, as more families are seeing their husbands, sons, brothers die. Westmoreland wants to request 206,000 more troops to be sent to Vietnam, but Johnson can't grant this, because if he allowed more troops to go to Vietnam and more people died, it would mean the end for any of his chances to seek re-election. He decides instead to attempt peace talks in Paris with North and South Vietnam. However, there is a deadlock. They can come to no agreement whatsoever. They can't even agree on the shape of the table or the types of chairs they're supposed to sit at, let alone the concessions that they'd want to come to a peace. And with the negotiations deadlocked, Johnson decides to not seek another term as president, which sends us into the Nixon era. Nixon realizes that Johnson has made a huge mistake, and he doesn't want to be the president to continue it. His strategy is to come at the Vietnam conflict with the idea of peace with honor. He wants to gradually withdraw troops from Vietnam, but he can't do it until he's certain that the South Vietnamese army is strong enough to handle the conflict on their own terms. According to Addington, Nixon starts a process of Vietnamization, which is to expand, equip, and train South Vietnam's forces in order to increase their combat strength and ability so they can take on the brunt of the conflict and the military combat role, while at the same time Nixon can gradually decrease the number of U.S. soldiers there. As the Vietnamese forces start to gain strength, he can, over time, pull more and more U.S. troops out. He also replaces the draft with a lottery, which significantly decreases the numbers of troops being forced to be sent over there. However, his strategy is somewhat two-faced in the fact that while he's trying to decrease the number of U.S. soldiers in order to end this conflict, at the same time, he also is attempting to escalate the war into Laos and Cambodia in order to destroy the northern end of the Ho Chi Minh supply line. He figures that if he can destroy their supply line, which was the same strategy used in the Civil War, that he can destroy the North Vietnamese army for good. When this is actually attempted and the media get wind of this and realize that Nixon's being two-faced, the anti-war response is immediate and more violent than it's ever been. It escalates into a massive uprising at Kent State, in which, as you'll see here on the cover of this newspaper, 4 people die and 10 are badly hurt. Here we also have a photograph of Nixon just before his trip into China, stopping in Vietnam with a South Vietnamese soldier. At this point, the support for the Vietnam War is so low that anti-war protests are popping up almost every day. Nixon decides his best course of action at this point is to negotiate a peace. But he needs to put pressure on North Vietnam to make them come to the table. He does so by visiting China and coming to terms with the People's Republic, as well as negotiating the Strategic Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty with Russia in 1972. Since he's managed to come to terms with these massive global superpowers, North Vietnamese are now feeling the pressure to seriously attempt peace talks, because they're not going to get the support from China and Russia that they once had. North and South Vietnamese finally come to the table. Unfortunately, the peace talks deadlock for another 3 years as the North Vietnamese attempt to get more and more concessions out of Nixon, to the point where the South Vietnamese are becoming so frustrated that they're ready to just throw their hands up and leave. In order to prevent this from happening, Nixon institutes the Christmas bombing strategic bases in North Vietnam, which cows the North Vietnamese, making them see that he's serious, and also showing the South Vietnamese that they need to stay. Finally, in January 1973, the Paris Peace Accords are signed, ending the U.S. involvement in Vietnam. And in March 1973, the last U.S. troops leave the country and finally come home.